Good afternoon and welcome to Roadmaps to Recovery, the first in a series of forums for hospitality presented by the Melbourne Food Wine Festival. My name is Pat Nourse. I'm the creative director for the festival, and today it's my pleasure to be moderating a conversation about how to negotiate the best position for your business to succeed as restrictions on trade for hospitality are eased. Now, if you tuned into the Premier's address earlier this morning, you'll know that restrictions on dine-in trade for restaurants and cafes will not be eased earlier than June in the state of Victoria. And there's every indication that it'll be longer still for bars. All of which means that when things do open up, it'll be all the more critical as a business owner to be prepared for what comes next. To help you get an understanding of what that might look like, our guests today are Lisa Livis, State General Manager, SME Banking for Westpac and the Bank of Melbourne, Bank of Melbourne being the principal partner of the Melbourne Food Wine Festival. Welcome, Lisa. Andrew Kaspen, a partner at Pointon Partners Lawyers, who specialises in, among other things, disputes involving the Retail Leases Act and contractual claims in property transactions and commercial agreements. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, everyone.
And rounding out the panel, we have Chris Lucas, a veteran restaurateur and the founder of Lucas Restaurants, which includes Kisame, Hawker Hall, Baby, and Kong, as well as branches of Chin Chin in both Melbourne and Sydney. Members of our panel, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, a very good afternoon to you all. We're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn, and then we'll open up the discussion to questions. With that in mind, I'd like to start off the conversation with some bigger picture context. Lisa, what does the broader economic outlook for Australia look like right now?
Thanks, Pat. So the Australian federal government, state governments, the Reserve Bank and the banking industry as a whole have deployed stimulus measures to try and limit the impact of the virus on our economy. Now, whilst the potential blow to economic activity is still very hard to quantify, it is clear that a recession is unfolding in Australia. It will be the first time that Australia has experienced a recession since 1991, and the technical definition of a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters or more of a contraction in economic activity or gross domestic product. Now, in the Westpac Group, our forecast is for a contraction in GDP, in economic activity, for the March quarter that has just passed, for this current June quarter that we are currently in, and for the September quarter as well, before the economy starts to recover in the December quarter. And the deepest quarter contraction will be in this current June quarter. And as you mentioned earlier, Pat, it will depend for Victoria. You know, there will be some movement depending on when full restrictions are being eased. Now, through 2020, we expect GDP or economic activity to fall by 5%. And that's not dissimilar to the Reserve Bank of Australia's forecast of 6%. We're a little bit more optimistic. Now, to put that figure into perspective, over the past 10 years, we have enjoyed in Australia annual growth that has averaged about 2.6%. So we've had a sustained period of economic growth. However, we are expecting GDP to recover by 4% next year, and the RBA expects a firmer recovery of 6 to 7% next year. So we're a little bit less optimistic and the RBA is a little bit more bullish. But the great thing is we are expecting there's going to be a recovery once, you know, restrictions ease, once people go back to doing their jobs, we expect there to be a recovery next year. Now, we know that Australia is not alone in this. The International Monetary Fund is anticipating world economic activity to contract by 3%. Now, that's the deepest downturn since the Great Depression, and it expects that the advanced economies of Europe, the US, are going to bear the brunt of this downturn. Now, what's our economic outlook for Victoria? Because we are proud Victorians. So, you know, Victoria has been the economic darling of Australia for some years now, and that's been mainly boosted by things like tourism, strong migration growth, and also that education is one of our largest exports. However, in Victoria, we too are expected to undergo a downturn like every other state and territory. Now, state final demand shows that the Victorian economy grew by only 1.3% in the year ended 2019. Now, that was the slowest pace in nearly 6 years. So we have been seeing a decline even pre-COVID, and well below the potential growth rate of 3.2%. Now, we are expecting in line with the rest of Australia for the economic activity to shrink in Victoria this year, but we are expecting a recovery early next year. Unemployment is one of the biggest indicators of a recession, and they go hand in hand. Now, more and more businesses in Australia are announcing permanent or temporary layoffs, and that's predominantly in industries where social distancing has had the biggest impact, where, people can't be together. And more, we're seeing more businesses that potentially had issues pre-COVID taking a very abrupt response to that now. Those businesses and industries that were tracking relatively okay pre-COVID are doing everything they can to try and keep their employees employed to ride through this economic cycle. Now, the current rate of unemployment sits at 5.2%. Now, we expect it to rise to at least 9% by the end of this year, and depending on which state or territory you are in, it may go into double digits, 10 or 11%. And the RBA has warned us that it expects unemployment to peak at 10%. Now, both forecasts are a long way off our rate, which we consider to be full employment at 4.5%. But the good news again is that, once restrictions are lifted and we get back to a normal economy, we expect that unemployment rate to come down. So in Victoria, we've seen jobs fall in the 5 weeks to April, end of April. Jobs fell by 8.6% in Victoria in the 5 weeks leading to the end of April. Now, the federal government's JobKeeper wage subsidy means the peak in the unemployment rate will be lower than it would have otherwise been. So a recent survey that we've conducted has showed that 44% of businesses said that JobKeeper influenced their decision to retain staff. And one of the ways that some businesses are adapting to this crisis is, where possible, instead of laying off staff, they're also reducing the hours that people are working. Now, once this passes, and as we said, we are expecting a downturn in economic activity for the balance of this calendar year, but we are expecting an uplift in economic activity in Q1 next year. So once this all happens, we expect the unemployment rate to return to about 6%. So there will be some longer term impact to unemployment, but we don't expect it to be, up in the 9s and 10% once things start going back to recovery. So business expectations and confidence. Over the next 2 months, a recent business survey that we've conducted revealed that 69% of businesses expected their reduced demand for their goods and services, and 72% expected a reduction in their cash flows. So business confidence has been low, and these remain challenging times. Now, that said, there are some industries that have done relatively well from this crisis, and agriculture is doing quite well because we are exporting now to other countries, and that's where we're seeing most of the airline travel happening. And there's been some industries such as recreation, gardening, home improvements, which have actually thrived during this pandemic. With respect to accommodation and food services, so they, without a doubt, have been the hardest hit. So nationwide, in the 5 weeks to the end of April, we've seen 33% of jobs lost in the industry. Across, is everyone still there? Because I've lost the visual.
We've still got your audio, Lisa.
Okay, I'll continue and hopefully it'll come back. Yeah. So, and across all industries, the drop in jobs was only 7.5%. So you can see that there is a big impact to accommodation and food services, 33% versus 7.5%. Other data shows that spending in Victoria on cafes, restaurants and takeaway food services fell 30% in March. But food retailing, including supermarkets, liquor retailing and other specialised food retailing, actually rose 26%. Now, given there were some changes in customer behaviour, particularly in April, and we saw a lot of our restaurants and cafes actually pivot to takeaway, it'll be interesting to see what those figures are for the month of April. Now, to finish on a brighter note, we need to remember that in this time, this crisis will pass. This is something that we are seeing an end date to, and confidence will recover as economic activity starts to increase off the back of easing of restrictions. Economies move in cycles, and Australia has been fortunate to have 30 years of pretty much uninterrupted growth. But the great news is, unlike other recessions, you know, there's a very specific cause to this one, and with government support and with the finance industry support, and I have to say all of our colleagues in the finance industry have a very big vested interest in helping our customers recover, we hope to see a recovery in Q1 of 2021.
I think we all echo that sentiment, Lisa. Thank you so much for that picture or that snapshot of what's to come. Andrew, Kaspen, you live and breathe commercial leasing. These are the waters in which you swim. This is just to mix the metaphor. The landscape has changed since the pandemic. What are the key changes to the legislation in Victoria that we should be alert to in hospitality?
Thanks, Pat. I thought I'd start by giving a brief overview as to how we've arrived at the point that we're at from a government response perspective, and to then focus on where to from here and what can be achieved in negotiations between landlords and tenants under the new legislation. The starting point was the National Cabinet Mandatory Code of Conduct in relation to small and medium enterprise commercial leasing principles, which was released in early April and which came to be known simply as the Code. And the purpose of the Code was to impose some leasing principles with respect to commercial tenancies and to provide landlords and tenants with guidance as to negotiating amendments to existing leasing arrangements in order to weather the storm from the current crisis. The Code has evolved into new legislation, some of which deals specifically with commercial tenancies. The Victorian government has now passed the COVID-19 Omnibus Act, and subsequent to that, a body of regulations which deal with commercial leases and licenses, to which we can refer for simplicity as the regulations. The regulations have retrospective effect. They cover the COVID-19 period, which is the period from 29 March to 29 September of 2020. They apply to eligible leases, which are in effect from as at the 29th of March. And an eligible lease is a retail lease or non-retail commercial lease or license under which the tenant is an SME entity, a small to medium enterprise entity, and an employer who qualifies for and is participating in the JobKeeper scheme. Now, it's important to understand that threshold requirement, this concept of an eligible lease. Agricultural leases, for example, or leases permitting the tenant to carry out farming activities are not eligible leases. And by way of another example, if the corporate structure of the particular business is such that the tenant and the employer are different entities, then in that event, the definition of eligible lease won't be satisfied because they are dual requirements. The tenant must be an SME and the entity that's participating in the JobKeeper scheme. Tenants need to follow a particular procedure under the regulations. They need to make a request for rent relief, and that needs to be accompanied by a statement that the lease is an eligible lease and not excluded from the operation of the regulations. And they need to provide evidence. They need to provide documentary information that the tenant is an SME entity, which in essence is an entity with an annual turnover of less than $50 million, and evidence that the tenant qualifies for and participates in the JobKeepers program. And once a request to the landlord is made, the landlord has 14 days to make an offer of rent relief to the tenant, and the offer must, at a minimum, provide for a waiver of at least 50% of the rent during that COVID-19 period, unless otherwise agreed. Beyond that, however, the terms of any variation of lease are a matter for negotiation between the parties. There can be a deferral of some of the rent, which will not be repayable until the earlier of the end of the COVID-19 period or the expiry of the term. And the deferral amount is to be amortised over a particular period of time under the lease, commencing from after the COVID-19 period. And a deferral will, under the regulations, require an extension of the term of the lease for the period of the deferral. There's no entitlement to a reduction in outgoings under the regulations, but landlords are required to consider waiving outgoings for any period that the tenant is unable to operate its business. And the landlord is also required to pass on any reduction in outgoings which it gets the benefit of to the tenant. And a landlord is required to take various things into account in making an offer. The offer of rent relief must be based on all the circumstances of the eligible lease, and the reduction in the tenant's turnover over the COVID-19 period must also be taken into account. Likewise, to even up the scales to a certain extent, the landlord's financial ability to offer rent relief, including any relief provided to the landlord by its lenders as a result of COVID-19, must also be taken into account in the landlord's offer. In other words, the landlord's financial circumstances is also a relevant factor to the terms of the offer. If the parties can't agree on a negotiated outcome, then any dispute can be referred firstly to an organisation known as the Small Business Commission for mediation. And if that doesn't prove successful, then it can be referred to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, or VCAT, for determination. Both landlords and tenants need to be aware that if the lease is not an eligible lease, then the regulations won't apply and the provisions of the lease will stand unaffected by the legislation, and the rights and liabilities of the parties to that lease will need to be determined based on those provisions. So in summary then, what are the takeaway messages from these measures? What do landlords and tenants need to do in order to get the ball rolling? In essence, there are 4 steps. Firstly, the tenant needs to satisfy the definition of an eligible lease. They need to be an SME participating in the JobKeeper scheme. Secondly, the tenant needs to provide the landlord with a statement saying that it has an eligible lease which is not excluded from the regulations. Thirdly, the tenant has to provide sufficient evidence that it's an SME entity and that it qualifies for and is participating in the JobKeeper scheme. And fourthly, upon receiving a compliance statement from the tenant, the landlord is required to make an offer within 14 days, which involves a minimum of a 50% waiver of rent, unless otherwise agreed, in addition to any other conditions that can be agreed upon after taking into account the shopping list of factors that are in the legislation to which the parties, or the landlord in particular, must have regard in making the offer. So that's where we stand. Tenants have their work cut out for them, I suppose. There is a bit involved in making a compliant request and statement and furnishing sufficient information to a landlord to enable the landlord to take all relevant factors into account. I can see a few pitfalls in terms of being able to meet those requirements, but with a bit of luck, landlords won't be taking too pedantic an approach in processing these requests. But I suppose the single biggest risk for tenants going forward, and for landlords to some extent, is to do nothing. And the reason I say that is because they're given certain protections under the legislation. For example, if you have an eligible lease, you won't be in breach of the lease if you don't pay rent. You can't be evicted, and the landlord cannot enforce any security that they may have. For example, typically it takes the form of a bank guarantee. They can't call in funds under the bank guarantee. And that provides temporary relief, but it's not a long-term solution because these regulations end on the 29th of September. And what happens come October at this stage is anybody's guess. If there is no legislation to take over from the current scheme, the position will revert back to what it was before the current scheme came into play. And that might leave tenants exposed with the real possibility of landlords trying to exercise their rights under, for example, a bank guarantee, if no agreement under the regulations has been put in place in that intervening period between now and then. So I think it's important for both parties to appreciate a real, not only desirability, but a need to go on the front foot and be proactive and come to some form of arrangement or agreement which is properly documented, rather than relying on a handshake or a couple of emails, to accommodate both parties' financial interests. Because if they don't do so, they do leave themselves open to the risk of things going seriously pear-shaped once all of this is over and the current financial circumstances haven't been adequately accommodated through any negotiation process and variation.
Thank you, Andrew. And if you've just joined into this forum, just tuned in rather to this forum just now, this is Roadmaps to Recovery with the Melbourne Food Wine Festival. Our guests are Livis from Bank of Melbourne, Westpac, Andrew Kaspen from Pointon Partners, and we're just about to hear from Chris Lucas, founder of Lucas Restaurants. Chris, you know, we've heard over and over again that the circumstances that we're living through are unparalleled, and there's certainly not, you know, there's no one in this Zoom who's encountered anything like this in their lifetime, but you have nonetheless weathered some rough weather in your years as a restaurateur. What have you learned from that? How do you prime yourself for you know, the bounce back that Lisa is describing to us?
Well, I mean, you know, it's business is never a you know, consistent path to glory. It's full of potholes and ups and downs, and to be quite honest, you know, it's not the first time we've had challenges put in front of us as an industry. I mean, you know, the industry has faced many challenges over the years. You know, I remember when the removal of the FBT happened back in the late 80s, it decimated the industry. It was a poorly thought through piece of legislation that was enforced on the industry without any consultation at the time, and literally brought in overnight and left the industry decimated. It meant thousands of job losses and undermined the viability of a lot of restaurants at the time. I mean, it was a very challenging time. And there's also been numerous recession.
What determined it, Chris, which businesses made it and which didn't?
Well, this is where it comes down to the fact that business, especially the restaurant industry that we've been born into or chosen to come into, it's a tough business. It's one of the toughest businesses in the world. It's a dynamic business. It's a fun business. It's a great business. So there's nothing better than making people happy and giving them delicious food and amazing experiences. But it comes at a horrific price. Long hours, thin margins, and in Australia, and in fact globally, the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen a huge rise in costs of doing business. So this crisis has brought to a head, in my view, what has been coming from a long time, which is there's been a perfect storm brewing, Pat, and you know this more than anyone else, that the industry has been facing headwinds, rising labour costs, exorbitant rent increases, the cost of manufacturing and fitting out restaurants, you know, the cost of power and utilities. There hasn't been an element of our business that hasn't been escalating faster than the ability of the industry to be able to raise its price of its food. In fact, to be quite honest, while our costs have been going up through a huge amount of competition and pressure from the competition, our prices for our products have been going backwards. So it was never going to end well. And in this business, it's a tough business. And quite frankly, you need more than just talent to survive. And I guess it's the same for any business. But in this business, it's also a very dynamic business. And this challenge has forced us to rethink, in my view, the very fundamentals of why what it takes to make a successful restaurant business, and to take a more pragmatic view of the challenges this industry face, which for a long, long time, quite frankly, we've been sweeping these things under the carpet. We've had a booming economy, both nationally and globally. We've had lots of tourism coming in. You know, we've enjoyed, you know, a rising property market, which has created a sense of wealth. And so the restaurant industry has benefited from that, but the costs have been going up too fast, Pat. And, you know, this crisis has brought everything to a head.
I mean, when the Lucas Group reopens its restaurants to dine-in trade, which hopefully will not be too long from now, and hopefully not under too,
I hope so.
not under too narrow a restriction in terms of how you can trade.
Yeah.
Will you be doing differently?
Well, of course, we'll be doing something different. We'll be doing everything differently. In fact, we're using this time, and I encourage all my fellow colleagues in the industry to sit down with their bankers and their advisors, with their HR people, to look at every part of our business. I've been using this opportunity. We've kept our offices open during this crisis for the sole purpose of looking and investigating and reviewing our business, seeing where we can make improvements, seeing where we need to adjust to whatever we think the market conditions are going to be. We've had to build some market assumptions as to what we think the next 12 to 18 months look like. I mean, I was listening to Lisa there, and she made some very interesting points and some very informative points. If in fact the economy is looking at at coming out of this recession potentially at the end of the year, and hopefully, you know, the consumer confidence, the ability of people to be able to get comfortable with hanging out with other people again in reasonably confined spaces. If we can get through that psychological barrier, which I think will be tougher than the economic barrier, and that 2021 sees some sort of stabilisation, we're working on an assumption that probably our business will be half the size that it was going into the crisis. And that in itself is forcing a rethink. Now, if it's better than that, that's great, but we're drawing a line at half and working from that assumption. That means we're reviewing all of our elements of our business, you know, our employment contracts, our product offerings, our venues, the way they're designed. You know, we have an opportunity while this closure is around to actually make some adjustments, physical adjustments to our venues, which we're doing. You know, our chefs are busily working away on new menus and new product offerings that are going to offer greater value for money. You know, we've got our sommeliers looking at the way we do our beverage programs, again, trying to drive value for money, because I think to try and entice the consumer back into the market, we're going to have to do something different. You know, I've been talking to a lot of restaurateurs, and sadly, some of them think it's simply going to be a question of just, you know, reopening the doors and all of a sudden we're going to be inundated with a bunch of happy diners. I think we're going to have to work. If previous recessions have taught me anything, you've got to go back to zero and start again. You've got to assume that you can't assume anything is going to be the same. So you've got to take that challenge upon you, and you've got to start thinking about, well, what was it that screwed up my business? What was it that was making it impossible for me to make money? What was it that was challenging the very core principle of hospitality? And all those things, as I said to you, have been going around for the last 10, 20 years. And we've sort of ignored them, or we've sort of allowed them to just sort of happen. But this crisis has drawn a line in the sand. And that includes, by the way, having a chat to your friendly landlord. Because, I mean, you know, rental costs have been going up at a much faster clip than what we've been able to charge in menu prices. And I think there's an opportunity there to sit down with our landlords as well and have a bit of a chat to them in a partnership sort of way. Because the other thing that I've learned in these last couple of weeks, Pat, is that we're not an island. No individual, even though this crisis has brought a sense of isolation and loneliness to people, people are willing, like I've never seen before, to help and reach out and support tenants, suppliers, employees. Everyone's in the same boat here. The banks, In fact, I must say, I'm a client of the Bank of Westpac, and they couldn't have been more supportive in what is a very challenging time. So I think we've got to take this goodwill, this period of goodwill, where the government has laid down some safety nets, and we can't waste this opportunity, Pat. If we waste this opportunity, there'll be no excuses when we reopen and some restaurants say, oh, I couldn't make it, I've gone broke. Because you're only going to have, I mean, I'm not trying to be too harsh here, but at the end of the day, no one's going to help you unless you help yourself first. There are a lot of people out there ready to help. I was just having a discussion this morning with our meat supplier who came into our office unannounced, and the reason he just wanted to help. He says, what can I do to help you restart your business? What product can I source for you? What can I do to help you get up as quick as possible? Because if you get up, then my business benefits. So I think there's been a lot of that going on, and now's a perfect time to rethink every single element of our business, right down to the flowers in the vases.
What are some of the practical changes you're making? I mean, I don't want to, engage in too much industrial espionage here, Chris, but have you guys made some firm decisions about what these changes might look like?
Yes. I mean, look, for starters, one of the things we're going to do, obviously, is we've decided to review all of our menus and our wine lists, so that doesn't necessarily mean we're just going to be discounting our product, because we don't want to do that, but we want to make it more relevant to a market that's been traumatized, Pat.
Yeah.
So that means maybe, the $35 or $40 glass of champagne is not going to be so exciting anymore. It might have to be a $15 glass of good Australian sparkling or Prosecco or something like that, but we can still make it interesting by getting a really good product. So that's one thing we're doing. The other thing we're doing is we're putting in place a whole bunch of new training procedures. One, we have to do it from a health and safety point of view, but we're going to retrain all our kids to try and meet what is, as I said to you, going to be a pretty traumatized consumer. We're going to, be even more welcoming than we have been. We've always been known for our customer service and trying to have a smile on our face, etc. And we're going to make a bigger deal about that. Try and make people happy. I mean, one of the things that we've been debating about was that with all the restrictions that have been mooted, what are our restaurants physically going to look like? And people are talking about putting signs up and putting, antiseptic bottles everywhere, etc., etc. And I said, look, stop. We have to do some of that stuff, but our restaurants have to look like restaurants, because people are going to want to escape the whole crisis. They're not going to want to walk into a restaurant and make them feel they're walking into the Epworth emergency ward. So it's about making the place fun again. So we're reviewing, for instance, all our music, making sure that, it's fun and engaging and lively, so that people can learn to have fun again. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the last 8 weeks hasn't exactly been, a trip down Disneyland, right? I mean, there's been times where it's been quite dark for us, and I'm a bit over it. And I think everyone else is. So I'm looking for some escapism. Our business is about that. It's not just about, and you know this again, Pat, more than anyone else, it's not about the hot dog or the steak necessarily, because everyone assumes we do a pretty good hot dog or a steak, if I can use an analogy. It's about the experience, the vibe, the socialisation, getting back in there and mixing with humans and having some fun. And people aren't going to be able to go to nightclubs for quite some time. They're not going to be able to jump on a plane and go overseas, except New Zealand, but who wants to do that, I guess. I know, sorry about that to all my New Zealand friends. I love to go to New Zealand, not often, but I do want to go sometimes. And the fact is that we've got to get back to the basics, which is what made the restaurant industry great, which is we are the social hubs. We are where people meet, talk, fall in love, have fun, and at the same time have a bit of a drink and something to eat. So we're really focused on jazzing up the experience, no matter what the restaurant is, including some of the new projects that we've got on the table, as you know about. And so we're revisiting all that as well. So, there's lots of things we're doing. And to be quite honest, the last 8 weeks, I didn't know where we would be in that first week of close down. It was just more trauma and shock. But since then, I've really enjoyed the free time to be actually able to sit down and think about what is our role as restaurateurs and as chefs and as professionals in this business, because everything has changed, Pat. And if people, that's another thing, if people don't think anything has changed and they think the same old stuff's going to be rolled out, this includes my friends in government, it ain't going to be the case. It's a whole new ball game.
I mean, each of you has sort of touched on this, and that is that it's not business as usual. I mean, just to state the bleeding obvious. I mean, Andrew, you said earlier, the single worst thing you can do, though you're faced by tough decisions all around, the single worst thing you can do is to do nothing. Lisa, is that the conversation you're having with the businesses that you deal with?
Certainly, you have to be proactive, and I think one of the strongest pieces of advice that I can give, regardless of who you bank with, is contact your bank and your relationship manager, which is something that Chris mentioned as well. Work together with your accountant, bookkeeper, whatever advisor you have, to be thoughtful around what are the possible scenarios that your business is facing, because you have to be very deliberate and proactive around discussing ways and thinking through ways you can respond and adapt. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But explore also all the support packages that are available. There is lots of government support, both at a national and at a state level. And also, as we know, all of the banks have got some very strong support packages to help small business. We know small business is the heartbeat of any economy. They're the largest employer. If you cannot support your small businesses to thrive and survive, then we don't have an economy. So we've got a very, very strong vested interest in helping our small business customers. So things that you can do, you can apply to have both your business and your personal lending have repayment deferral. And that is a very simple process, and that maintains your cash flow. You can apply again to have your merchant fees at Westpac Group refunded for the next 3 months, and that's something that we will continue to review.
So, I better apply for that straight away. I'll write that down.
You better apply for that, Chris. You better apply for that. So, you know, talk to your banks about exactly what is available, and there's lots of things available. Now, a lot of people have said, oh, I'm going to call my bank and I'm going to apply for the government unsecured loan, which there's an offer out there up to $250,000. That is something we discussed with our customers last. And the reason for that is adding to your debt during this time may not be the best thing for you. And particularly if you're not going to be repaying the loan for another 6 months and then you have to repay it in 2.5 years, that's a steep financial impost to your cash flow. So the best thing is work on what you can get deferred. And then also we have the JobKeeper temporary overdraft. Now we know that there was going to be a time lag between JobKeeper payments actually hitting our employees and our employers from when they were granted or applied for. And, you know, employers, Chris, like yourself, you still had to keep on paying your wages. So we've got overdrafts that are specific to fund that funding gap, time gap, between the payments being made and when the employer is making the payments. And that temporary overdraft lasts for 6 months. So I urge you all, if you have applied for JobKeeper, then apply for a temporary overdraft because it'll give you that breathing space in your cash flow. It's a really, really simple process. And all of this information can be found on our Westpac Group or BOM website. And we've got some fantastic packs that are available for customers, which basically cover all of these support packages, but also have a great summary of what support packages are available by the government as well. So you can find it in one handy location, and we'll ensure that we share that website with you. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was going back to not doing anything. You have to do something, right? And Chris really nicely put it into practice when he spoke about what he was doing with his businesses. But you have to sit down with your advisors and your bank and actually deliberately work through your scenario modelling, you know, and work with, you know, a first scenario of, you know, little change to customer behaviour. We've had a little bit of a decline, but, you know, we're doing okay. to scenario number 2, a significant downturn where some lines of your business may not be profitable, and this is a great opportunity to review everything. I don't know if they still use this term in the restaurant industry, but from soup to nuts. Review every part of your value chain, and is it still relevant to your customer base? Because again, as Chris said, it's not what you're selling, but it's what we as the consumers are buying, and it's more than just the food and beverages. It's that experience, it's that socialisation, all of those other things. And then lastly, a significant cash flow crisis where you've had sustained reduction in revenue, and you've got to really make a call as to, you know, what it is that you're going to turn that trajectory around or make some hard decisions. And whilst it's quite confronting, people that are proactive in doing this have a much better chance of coming out the other end. We've got customers within both our brands, Bank of Melbourne and Westpac, who have had to pivot. And like Chris say, you know, the first weeks were a huge shock, because I don't think we've ever experienced anything like that to our personal freedom. It's been very confronting, let alone people that are running businesses. But after that shock, they've been pivoting, and we've seen customers that were, you know, caterers for big events now producing, you know, meals for local communities to come in and buy, you know, boxes of goods available for you to, with very little, you know, human interaction to prepare a meal for your family. So they've been doing that. We've had another customer who is a winery, and it's a boutique winery, and they've really relied on selling their wines to the restaurant industry and also some cellar door. But they've widened their mailing list now, and they've come out to their loyal buyers. They haven't looked to discount their product, because that's a valuable product and it's valued by their customer base, but they've reached out and said, instead of these limits, now you can buy this amount, you know, if you're happy to support us. So I think, you know, being very thoughtful about ways you can pivot is going to be really, really important. And let's not forget, you know, this industry is all around social pleasure, and it will come back, but very different. We've got to expect that there are going to be some significant and permanent changes to our industry.
Thank you. So, and Andrew, what does a conversation with a landlord from a commercial tenant look like going forward? And I'm particularly interested, I think, in the in-between period. You know, we're getting used to what the lockdown looks like. We know what it looks like not on lockdown. The big unknown, particularly for restaurants in the medium term, is what these negotiations look like after September 29, but while we're still in a period of reduced trade. I mean, we'd all like to think that it won't be the case and that trade will be back at 100%, but we've got plenty of reasons to think it might be otherwise. How does that work? How does that conversation go?
It's a difficult one. Firstly, the tenants, both tenants and landlords, ought to feel, I suppose, encouraged. I mean, there's a acute financial need and interest in them in having that discussion, and they ought to feel encouraged in doing so. The Act actually says that the landlord and tenant under an eligible lease must cooperate and act reasonably and in good faith in all discussions and actions associated with matters to which these regulations apply. So there is that encouragement, and indeed it's an obligation on the parties to transact and negotiate in good faith. But to the actual question of that grey interim period between, in your example, September and the brave new world that we will face at some point in the future when things return to a relative state of normality, is a difficult one. And I think it necessarily involves a degree of speculation on the part of both the landlord and the tenant. In reaching a deal at the present time, I think parties need to factor in, as best they can, the process that we will go through come September and October and beyond, in terms of the uptake of participation in the industry. And my guess is that involves having to make some forecasts about what you think you'll be able to afford. It's almost impossible to do that reliably, but the legislation that we have is really the only means that tenants and landlords can facilitate going into that process and doing the best they can, given all of the uncertainties, to try and produce an outcome that they can both live with over not just the period between now and September, but beyond. So, for example, that might take the form of a waiver of 50% of the rent between now and September, which is mandatory under the regulations. Post-September, a waiver of, and I'm just giving you some examples off the top of my head, a waiver of 25% of the rent from September to, for example, March of 2020, and a deferral of 25% of the rent payable from September to March. And that deferral might kick in come July of 2021, so that the rent is actually pushed back for over a year and becomes payable from that period and is amortised over a sufficiently long period to allow it to not make or to minimise the impact of the impost that extra rent will require tenants to absorb. So there are plenty of permutations, I guess. There are plenty of ways of going about this to produce an outcome that is as sustainable as possible over the long term. And landlords and tenants both need to think flexibly and to do the best they can, as I say, to try and gradually bring us out of this process. The way forward, I think, is to have that, as I said, documented. And if there needs to be a variation to it down the track, the parties can agree. You don't have to set these things in stone forever and think that you're stuck or saddled with that deal until the end of until the lease expires or until the business goes broke or whatever outcome it happens to generate. But there will be a certain amount of guesswork involved. I think it's not something that can be reduced to unfortunately to a specific formula. And certain assumptions will need to be made about how to best accommodate that incremental and gradual uptake that everybody is hoping that we will see once these restrictions are lifted.
Chris, you were going to jump in there?
Yes, I mean, it's an excellent point Andrew makes. You know, when this first shutdown happened in that first couple of days, I did something unusual. I jumped on the phone and I personally contacted each one of the landlords that we have a tenancy in, the landlord himself rather than the agent. And the reason why I did that was I wanted to connect with the landlord, whom in many cases we don't chat or see each other often because there's really no need to. Some of my landlords I've actually never physically met or personally met, but it was an opportunity for me to connect with them because the point that Andrew makes, and this is a very, very important point, and that is that we have to take into consideration not just what this next couple of months looks like in this sort of mandated shutdown period, but we've got to try and work out what the market's going to look like for the next 12 months, 24 months, however long it takes to rebuild our businesses back to some form of normalisation. And quite frankly, that might not even ever occur. It might be a completely different world for how long we don't know. And so all the assumptions and all the agreements that we've had in place up until now, I'm taking the view that they have to be reviewed. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily say they're not relevant, but the reason why I connected with the landlords personally was I wanted to have a direct form of communication with them to say, we're committed, but we're going to need some help. I don't know what the help is going to be, quite frankly, because it could change from week to week, from month to month. And as Andrew pointed out, and Lisa has pointed out, I think the biggest challenge here is there's so many unknowns. We don't know what the next couple of months looks like, let alone the next year or so. And God forbid, for instance, there might be a second wave that everyone is talking about. Now, you know, we need to be able to have a communication line open with our partners, because I'm calling our landlords partners and our banks partners, because I do know one thing for sure: I'm going to need some help. I don't know what it's going to be, quite frankly, but I'm going to need to be able to move quickly to adjust for whatever the environment is. And so that might mean, you know, setting aside long-term agreements with the view to probably coming back to them in the future. But I think the underlying point that I wanted to make to my landlords and to the banks and so forth was, we're still going to be here. We want to be here. And so, you know, we're prepared to do our bit, but we are going to need that help. Now, as the last couple of months have rolled out, we've seen certain things, and we've been able to have that dialogue with our banks and with our landlords, because we've now got a relationship, perhaps it's a bit closer than what it used to be. And I think that that's going to hold us in good stead, because at the end of the day, nobody wants an empty tenancy. Nobody wants to see businesses go under, and no one wants to see unemployment. And in our sector, Pat, the majority of employees are under the age of 35 years of age. So we have a disproportionate number of young people working in our industry, and the pain and suffering to those young kids is enormous. And so everyone needs to pull together here. And I must say, Lisa, when I spoke to the bank, they were amazing. You know, they said, what can we do? You know,
that's good to hear.
They did miss that bit about the merchant fees, but I'll come back to that. And I must say, with our landlords, they've all been really good. You know, they've said, absolutely, you know, we want to keep you as a tenant, and we want to work with you in the long term. So I've said to them, look, the government's going to talk about some mandated stuff in the next couple of months. That's fine, and I might not necessarily take that up, or I may, but what I'm really going to want, I think, in the next 12 to 18 months and 2 years is, you know, a framework for dealing with whatever curveball this pandemic throws at us. And I think that's really important. We've got to take as I said before, we're not just going to bounce out of this. This is a 2 or 3 year rebuild, in my view. I might be wrong. Even if the economy does bounce back a bit, it's going to take time to rebuild our businesses. And for instance, with our banks, we're revisiting our loans and seeing how we can restructure those loans in the medium term to make them, to give us the ability to preserve cash flow so that we can keep our doors open. So, I think dialogue, maintaining the relationships, communicating, trying to avoid confrontation, because at the end of the day, as I said to you, it's going to be a long journey here, 2-3 years. So we've got to keep that in mind.
Chris, we've got a couple of questions that have come up from the audience. We're running out of time here, but if you would just want to address these very quickly, it's been raised a few times. Do you see takeaway being remaining part of your businesses once you start dine in?
No, I don't. I mean, I think there'll be, obviously there's a takeaway market, and there was one there before, but not for us. There may be a small element. We did a little bit of takeaway beforehand in some of our restaurants, but no, our focus is going to be on getting the diner back in the restaurant and having some fun. That's what our business is all about. So
Right.
I don't see much joy in sticking food in plastic containers and putting them into a brown paper bag and sending them off on the back of a motorbike in the middle of a storm, and hopefully the pizza arrives the right side up. To me, that's not a dining experience. So no, I don't.
I'm sorry to say we're at the point where we're probably going to have to wrap things up. I'd like to invite each of you just to leave our audience members either with the do it now takeaway or what you see as the opportunity in this moment. Lisa, what's your take there?
So I'm going to talk about an opportunity. As this pandemic has hit home, and off the back of the bushfires as well, we've got a really rising tide of social awareness and sense of community. So backing Australian farmers, Australian produce, Australian wine, it's a great opportunity.
Wine.
And Victorian wine.
I'm duty bound to get that one in there.
So just something to think about.
Back Australia, back Victoria.
Back Australia.
Yep.
Andrew?
I'll talk to the, unsurprisingly, the do it now point. There is a temptation, I suppose, given the protections that are afforded to tenants who have eligible leases, to be lulled into a sense of security because they can't be evicted. They're not on breach of the lease if they're paying rent. The security can't be enlivened. That's a temporary fix. It gives people some short-term relief, and it's not a panacea for the bigger term problems that they'll be facing for, as Chris said, possibly 2 to 3 years. So for their own peace of mind, they need to put in place something that is going to give them certainty of outcome, at least for that period of time, so they can get on with their lives and stay as sane as possible in what people continue to describe as these extraordinary times.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris?
The restaurant industry employs about 750,000 people, as I said, predominantly young. It is the hub, and it makes up an intrinsic part of our community. You know, you can see what the streets are like at the moment, and you know, you imagine reopening and there's no restaurants, or there's very few restaurants, very few cafes, very few bars. You know, we don't want to turn into an Adelaide. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. At the end of the day,
First New Zealand, now Adelaide, Chris Lucas. Yeah. I can't take you anywhere.
The thing is that, the thing is that what we really, I'm assuming, want to do as Melburnians and Australians is we want to rebuild our communities. Restaurants are a big part of it. And I'm not just saying it because I'm in the restaurant industry. I'm a consumer like everyone else. If you want your restaurants and your cafes and your corner butcher shop to come back, go to them. Spend the money with them. Go directly to them. Don't go through third parties. Don't go through delivery apps. Don't be enticed into some other element of it. Go to your local shop, restaurant, cafe. Support them. If you can, leave a few dollars. Sorry?
Cellar door, regional restaurants.
Yeah, if you can, leave a few dollars for the staff, because they're young people and they're finding their way in what's a very, very tough environment. And so spend local. Yes, absolutely. We're going to be here for a while. We're not going anywhere. And so make Melbourne your Saint-Tropez, right? And, you know, and spend the money here, because it will benefit us in the long term. You know, because if we come out of this and we save it, we're going to lose businesses. It's going to happen. I'm telling you now, it's going to happen, sadly. We've got to save as many jobs and businesses as we can. And we're only going to do it if we get out there in gusto and support these hardworking small business people who work 60, 70, 80 hours a week to make your cup of coffee and your donut. Okay? And let me tell you something, you won't know you've missed it until you've missed it. And if anything we've learned in this last 8 weeks is, I think, as an appreciation for the amazing experiences that we get in Melbourne through the restaurant hospitality business. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I miss sitting at a bar and having a drink. I miss someone, you know, bringing me a beautiful plate of food. I miss all that. And so hopefully we've gained an appreciation for what we haven't got in the last couple of weeks or last couple of months. So we've got to get back out there and just support those businesses. You know, instead of buying one coffee, buy 3 or 4 coffees for your friends at the office. Do what you can. It's all appreciated.
Here. Thank you, Chris. I'm afraid that is all we have time for today, but we will be convening another session right here on Zoom at the beginning of June. hop onto melbournefoodandwine.com.au and sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear about it. In the meantime, I hope you'll join me in thanking Lisa Livis, State General Manager, SME Banking, Westpac and Bank of Melbourne, Andrew Kaspen, a partner at Pointon Partners Lawyers, and Chris Lucas from Lucas Restaurants. And if you've registered for this session, we can give you any and all of their contact details if you need them. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you with us. My name's Pat Nourse, and thank you again for tuning into Melbourne Food and Wine Festival's Roadmaps to Recovery.
See you on the other side.
Thank you.
Till then.
Bye.